Hi, Ted. It's great to have you.
Likewise, thanks for having me.
So it's definitely an honor to have you today. First off, can you introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about your background?
Absolutely happy to. My name is Ted Coxworth. I'm the co-founder and head of product at Tapin Digital, where I help marketers understand what works and what doesn't and how to get better. My background prior to Tapin is in the world of data science, data engineering, and analytics, which I've been doing for a little over a decade now. And prior to that, I had a career as a scientist in the world of human evolution. So experimentation, which is a big part of what we're going to talk about, is something that I've spent a lot of years thinking about.
Sounds good. So I assume you like to get into the details of the methodology and how everything works.
I sure do. It's essential.
Perfect. So I got you help numerous brands adopt incrementality testing as a core measurement discipline. What's the most common mistake that you see marketers actually do or make when they try to do incrementality right?
Sure. The biggest thing for me is generalizability, which is kind of a jargon word. It sounds imposing. But to break it down, it's the idea that you want the outcome of your experiment to be something that you can expect to see if your experiment's successful and you roll out whatever change you are testing more broadly. So rather than just having a specific segment or a specific period of time for which the result is applicable, you want to design an experiment that allows you to see that kind of an effect across seasons and across segments so that you can have a broader lift on the metric that you're interested in. So some of the ways that people tend to miss the boat when it comes to making generalizable experiments or repeatable experiments is not having a design that fosters that kind of an outcome. So maybe you chose a market that's got some quirks to it, or we just saw this recently at Tapin helping a different client. Maybe you're choosing to run an experiment at a time of year that's heavily seasonal. And so the outcome of that experiment only really applies during the seasonal moment that you ran it. And then the third thing, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit more, is picking segments of your market that are, again, a little bit like the seasonal component, very unique or very small. And so you can't quite see across more segments how your intervention in the experiment is going to operate. In addition to design, one of the things that pops into my head in terms of having an experiment that doesn't apply broadly is poor execution. So with experimentation, I think plenty of people spend some time thinking about how am I going to design this in a way that makes it effective. I've seen really well designed experiments that don't have the outcome we're looking for in terms of business lift because of how the details are or are not transmitted to the marketing channel. Having spend that's a little bit different than what was put in the design, either too high or too low, maybe even spread too broadly. Having a campaign or a creative that doesn't line up well with what the go-to-market will be when the experiment's successful. And then a lot of these different platforms, digital platforms specifically, have some very important configurations that can really trip people up. So top line for me is let's make this an experiment that applies broadly. And then kind of the two areas where I see that not happening are with the design or with the execution.
Okay, very clear. And so you briefly mentioned audiences or segments. So now let's talk about audience construction. In your view, how do you define the perfect segment, the perfect audience for high confidence lift? And what do marketers often get wrong about who to test?
So the thing to start with when it comes to identifying a good segment is picking a piece of the market that's meaningful for your business. It can be a common trap, I would say, to identify a segment that's easy to test or is very, again, particular and unique. So it's easy to identify in the data and thereby roll out across the marketing channel that you want to test it with. But the goal, again, is to have a result that affects the business in a meaningful way. And so picking a segment or a group of segments that will have that impact on the business, very important for choosing segments. Another consideration, and this oftentimes is channel specific, so certain platforms have the ability to identify and target different components of a segment. So some marketing platforms can pick people based on demographics, whether that's location, age, gender, whatever it might be, and others don't. So picking a segment that works for the channel you're interested in testing, very important, because that will submarine the design otherwise. Then the last thing I'll mention around segmentation is picking a segment, in addition to being meaningful, in addition to being testable, that has enough individuals in it to produce statistically robust analytical data. Very important. Otherwise, you get mired in the worst possible outcome, which is an inconclusive test, which no one wants that. It's a waste of time and money. So, what are the things that go wrong in terms of picking segments? Not including the test segment in your control is probably the number one thing that I see in terms of going wrong with segments. Science is hard. It's not the way we tend to think about things. And so we need to have that segment both in the test condition as well as the comparison set. And that means having enough people in the segment that you can split it up between those two treatment groups. I did mention this briefly, but too small of a segment makes it really hard to have enough data to do that. And then one thing that we'll talk a little bit more about, I think, is when you have more than one test going on and you have a segment that you really like, it's very tempting to pull that segment or group of segments into more than one test that's running concurrently. And there are test designs that are really sophisticated that allow you to do that. But my advice always to the brands, to marketers is avoid that at all costs, because there's a very good chance that on the back end, the data are just too complex to pull apart those multiple signals in the same pool.
Clear. So something that we typically see, which is let's try and start with incrementality on a small audience, on a small geo, and if it works, we're going to expand and scale the activity, is actually kind of ticking all the don'ts that you previously highlighted, right?
It sure can. So I work with a lot of brands that want to do that very thing. And I actually think that's a very smart approach. So starting small and getting better. And the key there is balancing budget and timelines against this third thing, which is generalizability. Most people are very focused in on the first two, timelines and budget, understandably so. But that third piece, that generalizability, really needs to be part of the story as well.
Yeah, sure. Cool. Can you recall a negative lift test that fundamentally changed a brand strategy or unlocked some major insights? And what made it such a pivotal moment?
The funny thing about negative lift tests is that nobody wants to run them ever. This includes marketers, but also in the scientific world, nobody wants a result that's anything other than a positive result. They can be really powerful. And the way that I've typically seen them show up is in the form of natural experiments. So marketers need to stop spending in a channel for one reason or another, either an operational hiccup or a lack of budget, and they cut something off. And that means we've got this really rich, unplanned for windfall of analytical data that we can go look at to see this channel went away for a period of time. What did we see in terms of the KPIs that matter, whether that's signups or installations or revenue? So that's typically the form that I see them take. And I have a couple of examples that not only one is a natural experiment, but another one was needing to cut out budget and having a good test design in place for that process. So I'll start there. This is a brand that saw Meta as a big part of their marketing portfolio in 2025. We ran a media mix model with them on their historical data, including the 2025 data, and that MMM showed very little lift for Meta. So the guidance there was let's pull back, but let's pull back in a way that we feel confident. The pullback was the right move. So we designed an incrementality test, one of the negative lift tests that confirmed what the MMM had showed, which is that at the spend levels this brand was at, Meta was not incremental. So the outcome of that was a happy marketer. They knew they had to pull back in Meta. We found some evidence saying, hey, if and when you do, you're not going to see much loss of volume. They were able to take that savings and show much better CPAs and ROAS because of the negative results in the incrementality test. So that's one success story that was really rigorous, and everyone kind of went home happy, surprisingly enough, which typically you don't think of with these kind of negative results. The other one was this natural experiment, happy circumstance in some ways. We're working with a brand currently who does a fair bit of direct mailing. And in one of the states they send pieces out to, they had to stop. And this was an operational question. So they stopped for a couple of weeks and then said to us, hey, we just recognize the fact that we've gone dark in this state that we've been sending mail pieces to forever. Should we continue to hold off and see what the effect is on sales? And of course, yes, let's do that. If you can afford to keep it turned off, let's see how it goes. A little different analytical design with this sort of an approach because we don't have matched markets. We have to go find them. But what we found for this brand was in some markets, direct mail is incredibly powerful, very incremental, absolutely something they should do. In other markets, however, the conditions, which are mostly determined by legislative action, are not good for direct mail. It just doesn't make sense. So from that Go Dark test that was unplanned, we recommended and the brand executed a pretty big shift in tactics, or they're planning a pretty big shift in tactics for 2026. And we forecast that's going to have a really big upside for their sales volume and their ROAS because they're going to be able to allocate dollars away from places where this channel doesn't make sense and put that money in places where it does. So negative results, although not exciting, most people don't want to design a test for them, can be really, really helpful for making marketing programs more efficient.
Thanks. And sometimes the worst outcome of a test isn't a negative lift, it's actually inconclusive results. So, what do you see as the most common reasons tests produce that kind of ambiguity? And how can team wrap their head around it and avoid it?
So first, just to emphasize, inconclusive results, in my opinion, are the worst possible kind of results. You've spent time, you've spent money, you've put together this good plan, and you have nothing to show for it. Negative results are many orders of magnitude better than inconclusive results. Couldn't agree more with the premise of the question. What are some of the reasons for ambiguity in findings? Reason number one, at least the reason that I would nominate first, is having a test design that's just fundamentally underpowered. Either we don't have enough data going into the test, the spend or the impressions are too dispersed across a number of test markets. And so getting to a result is going to take forever, which is effectively the same as an ambiguous test. And likewise, in those kinds of designs, oftentimes, although this can be a separate situation, we don't have a robust, well-matched control to go along with the test itself. That can lead to a whole lot of ambiguity because what do we compare the test against? That is just as important as picking which segments to test out. Another reason for ambiguity is not doing your homework when it comes to the campaign, the creative, and the segments. So we need for all three of those things that, again, are generalizable, meaning when you get the positive result and you go put this action into place in a channel, you're going to see a similar consequence from the test. When there's instability in each of those things or any of those things, that can lead to a test that looks good and then looks bad and ultimately looks kind of murky. So luckily, there are some really good ways to research those three things, kind of creative, campaign, segmentation, ahead of time to say, how much variance do I see typically, historically, for these components? And if there's a lot, how can I mitigate that, either by pulling in another campaign, pulling in another segment, or choosing something else entirely for my test? So those are some of the reasons. I already talked a little bit about how to avoid. One thing that I will say more broadly, building on that last point, is having really good checks around your key metrics regarding statistical volatility as part of your test design. So not only do you want to know, is this campaign stable over time, creative segment, you also want to know, is the metric I'm interested in pretty stable? If that's something with a lot of volatility, maybe you have a long sales cycle, just know that this is going to take you a bit more time to see a resolution than it otherwise would. I've already mentioned this. I'll mention it again. It's really important. Have a really robust, well-matched control set. Just as important as the test segment. Third, I would say you really want to use conservative assumptions when you're designing a test. So if you think you might see a return on ad spend in the test of 3 or 4, maybe have a lift assumption there that says 2. And if you design a well-powered test around that assumption, the upside is you're going to end the test early. The downside is you're going to end it on time. There's not going to be this long-running thing that never really resolves. And then finally, to come back to the theme that I've been bringing up pretty much throughout, is we need to strike a good balance between, on the one hand, statistical power, which is usually favored by really focusing in, getting more specific, and generalizability. You got to keep both of those in mind when you're designing your experiment.
Thanks so much. So yeah, it really all comes back in the end to designing the test properly in the first place, keeping all those advice in mind. Many teams actually struggle to communicate incrementality results to their leadership. So how do you explain incrementality to a leader or a CFO who wants deterministic answers and clean ROI logic?
Absolutely. Great question. Communication is a huge part of this process. Has to be any analytical process. We're talking about something that's very technical, even with incrementality tests where you can keep them fairly simple, still very technical. And so how do you communicate that broadly to an audience that isn't in the details? And my advice always is start with the punchline. What's the result of the test? And keep it as simple as you possibly can as you're communicating this. So most people are able to go pretty intuitively. You didn't do a marketing effort in one place or with one group of people, and you did do it with another. And in the place where you pursued this marketing effort, we saw more sales. That's pretty intuitive to most people. When executives start getting turned around is if an analytical team or a marketer designs a test and includes all of the caveats, the considerations that went into designing or executing the test as a lead in to the results. That's a guaranteed way to get caught up in the details and undermine the credibility of what you're doing. So that approach to communication can be very powerful. The way to set yourself up for success in that is design a really clean, simplistic test that's easy to analyze and communicate. That way you don't have to summarize a lot of complexity. So that's just one way to make it easier on yourself when you're going through that initial, here's the punchline. And then if someone needs details, being able to walk through those details without spending way too much time doing so.
Another question I have is when scaling incrementality across an organization, how do you keep testing efficient without sacrificing rigor? Especially when you're trying to move from 1 or 2 tests a quarter to maybe tens or a dozen a quarter.
Point number one, when it comes to getting more efficient and more sophisticated and more robust with the testing program, is a point that you can make more broadly across business operations. And that's that communication and clarity is key. So being able to coordinate these tests effectively to make sure, like I said earlier, that you don't have the same segment in multiple concurrent tests, for example, absolutely critical. Communication and coordination on the back end is also critical. We just talked about making sure that the findings of a test are easily taken on board by the leadership team. That has to be a major part of moving to a more sophisticated, robust testing program. So that's where I'll start. In addition to that, having robust processes in place and procedures in place for test design, ideation, analysis, deployment, all those pieces, essential. So that you don't have to think about each one of these tests as a custom process. There's going to be details that matter that are different. We talked a little bit earlier about different marketing channels and platforms having different demographic factors that you can use in designing a test. Those will be part of any testing program. Having the same approach across all of the tests. Here's what we do first, second, third, fourth, fifth. Here's the considerations that we make in the design phase, the analytical phase, etc. Allows you to have high quality, robust tests at a high rate of throughput to get to that level of sophistication where every brand wants to be. So I guess what I'm saying is that testing system, it becomes an engineered system in its own right. You've got templates for test design, for deployment, for analysis, all of this stuff, and a really well-defined backlog of ideas for testing, as well as a really clear process for prioritizing those tests. My guidance always is start with the thing you think is going to be most impactful and work down the list. Always, always, always.
Sure, always start with the most important. And we always want to test new things, but another question I have is, should you redo some tests periodically to ensure the results are stable, or you would only advise to redo an incrementality test that was already done before only if circumstances changes?
I think there needs to be a good reason to rework an incrementality test. And there, luckily, are many good reasons to do so. Performance seems to have changed. We know that the market changes. We also know that especially in the digital world, the tools that we have available to us change. Creative changes. All of these are good reasons to just go back and check, especially for very important campaigns or very important audiences, to say, hey, this is what I thought it was, but I need to revalidate my assumptions there. I'm not a huge proponent of having kind of a schedule for rechecking tests that have already been done. There needs to be a good reason to commit to the cost and the time involved, in my opinion. But like I said, there's a whole host of reasons. And just making sure that you have a good grip on what's the upside of taking the time to implement this test will ensure that if you're looking to retest, that's part of your parking lot, it gets prioritized appropriately against everything else you could be doing.
You talked about the importance of systems and of organizational test and learn culture. What signs tell you if a brand is ready to adopt a more experimentation-led approach? And where do you typically start to build that muscle?
Sure. Signs that an organization's ready to start moving towards test and learn culture, I would nominate curiosity generally about what's working. It's not always obvious to see what's performing well and what's not. And oftentimes that can lead to disagreement. And I would actually consider those kind of a similar thing. Curiosity and disagreement tend to go together, I would say, in organizations. That's one piece. Another piece would be an interest in trying new things. Oftentimes that's a great opportunity to try some testing. And then maybe an interest in transitioning away from how decisions have been made towards more of a data-driven approach. So that would be another opportunity to start testing. And then where do you start if there's interest? Number one, make it easy on yourself. So there are plenty of platforms. Meta comes to mind immediately that have built-in tools for testing. Start there. There are going to be very good guides. Very smart people have worked on how to deploy them. Make it easy on yourself. And like we've already talked through, look for big opportunities. So how can I make it easy from an implementation standpoint? How can I make it easy to get a win in the world of experimentation? As you're just starting out, those are the two things you want to look for.
Incrementality has been here for a while, and I think methodology evolved over time. But looking ahead, what do you think the biggest shift will be in how incrementality is practiced by high-performing teams over the next 3 to 5 years?
Two pieces here. First, I would say, with my experience and background, direct integrations with media mix modeling are going to be a big part of effective incrementality testing. These two analytical techniques have very different strengths and weaknesses, and I find that they are both more effective when they work together. So direct integration between testing and media mix modeling makes a ton of sense to me. We're already starting to head in that direction. Secondly, I expect to see less and less friction in the world of incrementality testing, from design to deployment to analysis, communication, all of it. There's some really cool brands working out on these problems, and I expect that those tips and tricks they find will make it into the broader marketplace so that everyone can design, deploy tests quickly and easily and start getting more and more effective with their marketing portfolio as a consequence.
You talked about MMM and incrementality, which seems to be the most, let's say, forward-looking approach when it comes to measurement. How do you see those two combined, or what's the power of having them combined? And if you could talk a bit more on how it works.
Sure. So MMM is a tool based on correlation, fundamentally. Lots of very sophisticated machine learning algorithms go into it, but ultimately it's looking at the relationship across time and place between marketing and the metric of interest. Correlation's very good at finding out relationships or figuring out relationships where there's a lot of stuff happening at once. So looking holistically across an entire marketing portfolio, here's what we think's moving the needle. MMM's great at that. We've used MMM to find opportunities that maybe were undervalued in the past that should be tested because correlation and causation are two very different things. So the way that I see them relating together, MMM is kind of an engine or a laboratory for finding opportunities for testing. Testing is a way of providing concrete causal evidence that, hey, this particular approach to marketing is driving the metrics of interest. So that's the feedback that I see between them. Incrementality testing, in my mind at least, is always going to be the gold standard of understanding what drives sales. MMM is very good at taking a broader look to say, we've got a bunch of stuff going on. It's all going on together. And given that, here are the opportunities that seem to be worth pursuing.
Identifies opportunities, and the other one allows to size them, if we could say so, right? Ted, thanks so much for your time today. I'm sure people were super interested by your insights. So where can they find your work? And is there anything you want to share with us today?
Yeah, thank you, Kumar. That was a great conversation. I'm excited to hear from people who are interested in more in incrementality testing. They can find me on LinkedIn. They can also find Tap and Digital there, also on socials, so Instagram and X. If you're curious to learn more about incrementality testing, we do offer 90-day pilot programs at Tap and Digital. You can learn more about that at our website, or you can send me an email, which is ted@tapanddigital.com, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Ted.